Melchizedek is a person that Abraham interacted with in the story of Abraham in the book of Genesis. He's a king, and we're going to find out he has something to do with Jesus. The author of Hebrews is going to try to teach us some stuff about Jesus by talking about Melchizedek. We're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 14. This is the story of Abraham and Melchizedek. We're going to have just a quick look at Psalm 110, other place in the Old Testament where his name comes up, and then Hebrews chapter 7. So here's the main point so far. God's creation and God's people are never going to be what they're supposed to be till we get a perfect priest king. Every time a priest king comes up, like David or Gideon or one of those stories, the human being who fills that role always fails and things go bad. But nothing bad is ever said about Melchizedek.
Right.
In fact, he typifies the order of priesthood in Psalm 110 that the Messiah is going to fill. So something really amazing and strange is going on. And I think that's what the author of Hebrews is going to pick up on.
Exactly.
When we were at our link group on Monday, Kaylee asked a really good question, which was, you know, there's this stuff in Genesis 1 when it's talking about heaven and the expanse, the firmament, and the waters above and the waters below, and not all Christians agree on what all those things are. And so she said, but then if we don't agree on stuff, how can we be sure that we're going to heaven? I mean, right now we're talking about heaven in Genesis 1, and we can't even agree what it is, you know? And so she's saying there's disagreements all across Christianity, and yet we all are making the claim that because of what we believe, that we're one day going to spend eternity with God. So how can we have any kind of certainty? That's a big question. And I had gotten a little bit desensitized to the question because it's a question I live with. All Christians live with all the time. And I've just gotten used to the fact that there are some things that are core and fundamental and other things that are more peripheral, and we can disagree on those things. We agree on the core stuff. And this is a really good example because Melchizedek is something that you and I disagree on, at least in some way. And yet we're both sitting here saying this is really important and we need to learn what the Bible's saying about it.
Sure.
So I hope people who are struggling with that question might be able to listen to this conversation and just it might be just a few puzzle pieces coming together for them as an answer for
Absolutely. Because even within this subject, there are certain things that we will disagree on or agree on and believe that it's important for us to agree on because the scripture is clear on those things. But then the conclusion of it is where we may have some differences of opinion, and that's perfectly fine. If those things needed to be agreed upon, then the scripture would be more clear on that.
Yeah. All right. So Hebrews chapter 7, I think now we're getting into the part where you're more prepared for this conversation than I am. I have this much notes on the Old Testament.
Right.
If you're listening, my hands are about 10 inches apart. And I have about this much notes on the New Testament, and now they're about 3 inches apart. So we'll dive into Hebrews. I have some thoughts on Hebrews 7, but you've looked further into previous chapters as the author of Hebrews is talking about Jesus as our great high priest.
Right.
And he's going to use Melchizedek to help explain what that means.
Right.
So we can't, I don't think, read all of these chapters here. Do you have any bits of chapters 5 or 6 you wanted to mention?
So he's first mentioned in chapter 5 and starting in verse 6. He's actually not going all the way back to Genesis yet.
Right.
He's starting off in Psalm 110.
Yeah.
Yeah, he says, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And then he goes and describes why he is saying that in verses 7, 8, and 9. And he says, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers, supplications, etc., etc. Verse 8, although he was a son, he learned obedience. Verse 9, and being made perfect or glorified, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. And then he links back to where he started out in verse 10, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek.
Yeah. Yeah.
So twice he uses that phrase, after the order. The word order in that particular word in the Greek means a designation or a numerical order. So it's not necessarily at this point. Now he will use another word later and call him after the fashion of Melchizedek, which means that he looks like or acts like. But this word order actually means like a numerical order.
So the concept is when one priest is done being priest, a new priest takes his place. And
Right.
that's the order.
Yeah.
So Jesus is the priest that follows on in Melchizedek's actual line.
Yes,
of kinship.
exactly. But what's peculiar is later on we're going to learn in Hebrews that he tells us that God cannot go back on his word. So if he says Melchizedek is a priest forever, then Melchizedek is still a priest. So how can Jesus follow on in an order that hasn't yet ceased? And that's one of the questions that we're forced to deal with.
Yeah.
So that was Hebrews chapter 5.
Yep.
And then he goes on, and in Hebrews chapter 6, the point that the writer is making is that all the way back in Genesis, God couldn't swear to Abraham by anything higher than himself. Because when you make a promise, you say, I swear by, the moon above or the stars, or I swear by the earth.
Yeah.
Something bigger than yourself, something that's going to last longer than yourself, outlast you. So that's why you're promising that, because it's gonna last your entire life.
Yeah.
And beyond this. But there was nothing that existed that God could swear by that was greater than himself. So he swore by himself. And that's the point he makes all the way down to about verse 19. And then you get down to verses 19 and 20, and he says, we have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. So in other words, our salvation is secure not because God swore by the earth or the sun, he swore by himself, and there's nothing better than that. And then he describes that, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain, which we alluded to earlier. And of course, that curtain is in Jerusalem, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest. And there's that phrase again, after the order of Melchizedek.
Yeah.
So it's the idea that Jesus went in there because we couldn't. And he's not just talking about, I don't think he's physically only talking, about the temple located in Jerusalem with the curtain. I think he's talking about what that place represented, which was the very presence of God.
Yeah.
And no person could go into that. Even a priest couldn't go into there.
Right.
A priest couldn't go into where God actually lives.
Yeah.
He could only go into what that represented, which was the Holy of Holies.
Yeah.
And when Jesus went there, he tore that apart, allowing God and man to now have perfect fellowship. And that is all described as just like Melchizedek.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you're making this connection that this Melchizedek was not just a good guy.
Yeah.
There was something really special
Yeah.
about this individual.
Yeah. Yeah, good. And that verse, if you don't have your Bible in front of you, is immediately before chapter 7 starts, where the author of Hebrews is going to start rehearsing the story of Genesis. So it seems like chapter 5 and 6, he is meditating and expounding on Psalm 110, and then he's going to take us further back when we get into chapter 7,
Right.
to start talking about, okay, so where did this guy come from?
Exactly.
What do we know about him?
Exactly.
Or where didn't he come from?
Yeah,
Actually, is a better way to
exactly.
say
Yeah.
that.
And so what you see in 5 and 6 is Jesus being linked to Melchizedek in some way or another, and then all of a sudden in chapter 7, it's like the author of Hebrews is thinking to himself, so in case you don't know what I'm saying here,
Right.
let me tell you about this Melchizedek.
Yeah, yep. And he's gonna pull out some interesting stuff from the story that we 21st century probably never would have thought of when we read it. So,
Right.
he starts off in 7 talking about his name. He's King of Righteousness, and then talking about where he's king of, which is of course Salem, and he says
Right.
he's King of Peace. And these are sorts of terms that the New Testament will use for Jesus, of course, King of Righteousness and King of Peace, and
Exactly.
and things like that. So he's strengthening that link between Melchizedek and Jesus there. And then he says this thing. He says he resembles the Son of God, continuing a priest forever, which is an interesting statement. Melchizedek as this guy who talked to Abraham. You probably would have read the story and assumed sometime after that he probably died and was buried or was burned or whatever, and the world went on. But Hebrews says in some way or another, this guy continues as a priest forever, and in that way resembles the Son of God.
Right. Right.
And so what he points out is that a lot of the characters in the Old Testament, you know where they come from, and then you know who their descendants are and where their story goes. But we get none of that with Melchizedek.
Right.
Yeah, there's no genealogy. He's not Melchizedek, son of this person.
Yep.
He doesn't tell us who his descendants are and goes on or anything like that. He just comes on the scene, and then he's gone.
Yeah.
So in that way, he has no beginning or end,
Right.
and he continues forever.
I love the part in verse 2 that, and I don't know if you were planning on going back to that, where the writer of Hebrews now gives us some significance to why Abraham gave him a tenth.
Yeah.
Because we're just told that he did.
Right.
And earlier we wondered why would he do that? You know, what was the point? And in verse 2, we see that, and we see one of the reasons why. And the writer of Hebrews points out in verse 4, first of all, how great a priest he was.
Yep.
In verses 5 and 6, he points out that all of the priests were actually descendants of Abraham. So technically, Abraham shouldn't have given him a tithe unless he was greater than Abraham.
Yeah.
The inferior doesn't receive tithes from the superior.
He says the same thing about the blessing.
Exactly.
He says, Melchizedek blessed Abraham, which means Melchizedek is the higher one.
Right.
Who's giving a blessing to the lower
That's
one.
right.
So he's making this point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's also making a point that surely then this priest that Abraham gave a tithe to must be greater than any priest that would come from Abraham.
Yeah. Yep.
And that becomes then important to us, because the writer has already made clear that Jesus was greater than any priest for a number of reasons. Now he's pointing out that he's greater than the entire priesthood put together, even in principle, because the originator of that priesthood actually submitted to Melchizedek.
Yeah. Is there anything else we want to point out about what Hebrews says before we start talking about what it means?
The rest of it mostly is trying to figure out who he is by that. But yeah, I think that's probably a good place for us to go next.
Cool. And I think this is where we have to acknowledge that you and I have at least somewhat different perspectives. Do you want to describe yours first?
Sure. Let me back up and say that anytime we see a type of Christ or in the Old Testament, a lot of times it is a person or a thing, an object, an instance that is going to point us forward to who this Christ is.
Like David.
Like David, or even the flood. The ark is seen as a type of Christ because it saves people through a great calamity and things like that. So a lot of things are seen that way. Certainly Melchizedek would be, because he is described as a type of Christ. So the question is he merely a type of Christ, an individual, a person who had a lot of the features of the coming Messiah, or is he actually Jesus in the flesh who appeared on the scene, did these things, and then left? And I take the position, I believe he was actually Jesus in the flesh.
So less like David and more like the angel
of the Lord.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the position I take.
Yeah.
Whereas you probably take...
Yeah. So the way I would articulate my position is that there's no reason why he can't be that, so I'm open to it. But I also don't see that as being necessary to explain what the Bible says about him.
Right.
So for me, the connection between Jesus and Melchizedek, it's sufficient to say the Old Testament was intentionally making the point that we needed a perfect priest king, and that Melchizedek can be cast as that character without literally being that person, because the Old Testament does that a lot.
Right.
So then when you get to the New Testament, it's totally appropriate for the author of Hebrews to bring Melchizedek into the discussion and say, Jesus is more than just the continuation of the priestly line of Aaron. He's the continuation of that theoretical perfect priestly line that we always needed, like Melchizedek showed us.
Right.
So it's more of a literary thing than him being actually Jesus,
Right.
who turned up and then, ascended back to heaven or something when that bit of the story was over, or however you wanted to put it.
Right. And neither of us is so dogmatic on our views that we are not open to the other view.
Right. And I think this is really the point maybe of this episode. Besides understanding Jesus is the priest king and who Melchizedek is, a really significant thing is the reason why neither of us, I think, are really dogmatic is because we are both upholding the same point of what the Bible is saying, and neither of our views is less exalting to Jesus.
Right.
We're both saying the Bible is saying Jesus is that ultimate priest and that ultimate king who makes once for all intercession between us and God, and is therefore greater than the priestly line of Aaron. And that's what the author of Hebrews wants us to say.
Right.
Just the detail of was it actually Jesus in the Old Testament or just a picture of him is actually not that significant.
Right.
Because we agree on what the point is. And I think in a lot of the times when people disagree about the Bible, common ground is still found.
Right.
In understanding the point and exalting Jesus as a result.
Yep, absolutely. I had this picture in my mind of why I believe this and how it could very well happen. And if you can just imagine that you're watching a film, and all the way through the film, it is a film about Jesus, and all the way through it, he's been wearing an article of clothing. He has a certain length of hair. You've seen him and you know who that is. But then there's this one scene where this individual comes in. You don't really see his face, but you see that this individual is wearing the same articles of clothing. And from the back, it looks like it could be him. He does something and then moves out of the scene. So you're led to believe that was Jesus, but there's not, you don't actually see his face. So there's still possibly a doubt that it wasn't him.
Sure.
But it sure acted like him.
Yeah.
And
That's a good example.
And that's how I see this.
Sure. Yeah, good. I like that. I think the way I see it, using the same example, is you're watching a film and throughout it there's been important characters and their clothing or their hair or something has been distinctive. And then all of a sudden Jesus turns up and you notice in his clothes or in his look, it kind of looks like some of those other guys.
Exactly.
And so you're not thinking as watching the story, hey, those guys were actually Jesus. You're just thinking they were giving us information about who we would be.
Sure.
So it's a little bit different in that way.
Yep. If you don't mind, I'll take a few minutes to describe why I think it is Jesus.
Yep.
And maybe you could, either give some reasons why you don't think. To me, the biggest argument for this not being Jesus is found in verse 11, but we'll get to that in a minute.
Sure.
In verse 3, he says he's without father or mother genealogy. He doesn't have a beginning, and he doesn't have an end, and he resembles the Son of God. I don't know that there's anybody else in Scripture, an individual who is not Jesus, that's described that way. So that's what pushes me in that direction.
Yeah. Sure.
Again, I think if he's not Jesus, then maybe he wasn't even a real person, a physical, actual person to begin with. Because if he was this type of a person, then he certainly wasn't a mere mortal. And I think that is even described for us later on. where it says mortal priests, and in contrast to
Right.
to this person. So and he's described as a priest forever. Well, there's the need for the priesthood and priests ends if we're talking about that type of a priest,
Yeah.
or even an intercessor that ends with Jesus. But this Melchizedek continues to be a priest even after Jesus is shown to be the perfect priest.
Yeah.
And so there's that argument. What is this Melchizedek's role if he is not fulfilling the role of Jesus forever? Again, the biggest problem is verse 11, where
Because of the word another.
yes, exactly, yeah.
So verse 11 says, "Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arrive after the order of Melchizedek?"
Exactly. And so that's when we have to say, are we talking physically, literally a second one after his order, or is there some other meaning to that?
Yeah.
And I don't have the answer to that.
Yeah, I get that. And that makes sense to me. And I also think your arguments are really persuasive in that we've talked a lot about how there's all of these Old Testament pictures of Jesus. But one thing that is consistent is that every time there's a story at the end about how they failed. They're never perfect.
Right.
To show us we need one who will be. And that's never said about Melchizedek.
Right.
And so it seems like you said, he's more than just a regular person. To me, I think that makes sense as an argument, but I guess it doesn't totally persuade me, only because I think that's the point of his typology. In that we're supposed to see all through the story the imperfect priesthood of the Levitical line, and know that there is a better, more perfect version of that God is trying to lead us towards. And the only way Melchizedek can be a picture of that is by showing it to be one that lasts forever, that there's nothing bad said about. If something was said about him bad in his story in Genesis 14 or in Psalm 110, it would degrade the picture of Jesus, not enhance it, like it does with the others. So, and again, that doesn't mean he can't be.
Right.
I just think that it's explained by the literary point of the passage.
Sure.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, verse 15 is the one place I alluded to earlier. It's the one place where Jesus is described as not coming after the order of Melchizedek, but coming in the likeness of Melchizedek.
Yeah.
You're struck with either a concept or at least a possibility that Jesus is subservient to something, because he comes in the likeness of this.
Yeah.
So it's like when people say, "You're my son." You know, it's because I came first.
Like what Jesus said about David, and he said, how can he be his Lord if he's his descendant?
Exactly.
Right.
So now Jesus has come and is described as coming, and he looks like Melchizedek.
He's later in the order.
Yeah,
Right.
but he also looks like him. So if it's not himself, then who is this Melchizedek? He must have been something pretty special.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. One thing maybe to bring up is we mentioned this briefly at the end of our last conversation, how during the time between the finishing of the Old Testament and the arrival of Jesus, the Jews read their Bibles and they speculated and they wrote more things to try to understand them best. And they picked up on this Melchizedek being something more. And so the angel of the Lord sometimes thought maybe that's Melchizedek.
Right.
I think there's one story that shows Melchizedek as being this ultimate angel who's second only to Yahweh himself, kind of a thing. So they were saying he needs to be more than a person.
Right.
And with all of that going on in the conversation, I think helps us in one sense understand why the author of Hebrews is bringing him up. Because he's been trying to explain Jesus is greater than angels.
Right.
Jesus he's so much more than you thought the Messiah would be. So if you thought the Messiah was going to be Melchizedek, Jesus is blowing that category wide open. It's so much more.
Sure.
And I think in that is both evidence for your view and mine. In the sense that first of all, people already thought Melchizedek was more than a person.
Mm-hmm.
And so that lends credence to the idea that he really was.
Right. Right.
And for the author of Hebrews to say that person who you thought might be the Messiah really was, but more so than you thought.
Right. Right.
He was actually Jesus, who is God himself.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it also is some support for my view
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that it helps us understand why the author of Hebrews would talk about him in this way if he's not Jesus.
Right.
Because
right.
these are the types of things people were already saying about Melchizedek,
Sure.
which makes him a good candidate to explain who Jesus actually is.
Right. And it does make sense when you know you look at Hebrews and he's saying, well, Jesus was better than all of the priests. And then somebody throws up the idea, well, what about Melchizedek? He was like a super priest.
Yeah.
And then he's now going on to say, well, actually, yes, he was, and here's all these amazing things about him.
Yeah.
But Jesus is even better than the super priest.
Right.
I mean, I've still got two other verses I'm going to throw at you.
Go ahead.
I got two darts left,
Yep.
as it were. So in verse 16, following verse 15, this becomes more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest. Now, so we're still talking about Jesus. Not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. Again, we're going back to Melchizedek and Jesus both appeared to have an indestructible life.
Yeah.
So if this Melchizedek is not Jesus, he certainly is something extraordinary and
Supernatural
special.
being of some
Yeah.
kind.
And when you then go back and say, well, he's a supernatural being who offered bread and wine for communion. He's a supernatural being who deserved to be worshipped with his tithes. He's a supernatural being who all of these other things you think, but if he's not Jesus, he's just like him, which is the point that
Yeah.
the writer is trying to make.
Yeah.
And then my last one
Okay.
is actually found in verse 21. We can start at verse 20. And it was not without an oath, for those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath. But this one was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. So who's he referring to? I believe he's referring to Jesus. But he's referring to Jesus and Melchizedek at the same time. It's because that has been said about Melchizedek. You are a priest forever. And so he's, again, linking those two things together. And my point is, how can Melchizedek be a priest forever if Jesus has replaced the need for any priests other than himself?
Yeah.
So that's where I fall down on it. But I also totally get that he may have just been some amazing supernatural immortal
Yeah.
that came and
Yeah.
laid the groundwork for what the Messiah would eventually look like.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I think those are good arguments, and I think it's a good view to hold. To me, I'm still pretty comfortable with the idea that I would even go so far to say that Melchizedek was just a man, but he was talked about in a way that described him as more than that to give us the idea. And the author of Hebrews is not trying to say he actually had an indestructible life.
Okay.
It's just trying to say it's intentional that we don't hear his beginning or end,
Sure.
so that he kind of gives us the outline of the picture. And that's what he means by an indestructible life.
Yeah.
And so he could just be a person, but his literary character is what's being described,
Sure.
not his literal life and
Right.
who he actually was. And again,
Yeah.
maybe not, but to me, that's okay.
Well, yeah, and your view has other principles that have already been laid down. For instance, you've got Enoch, who walked with God and was not. So you've got an
Right.
individual who
Right.
didn't die.
Sure.
At least if we take that on face value.
Yep.
A person who didn't die. And yet we know every person has to die
Right.
to pay for the sin that Adam passed down to them. So what happened there? You know, it's filled with more questions than anything.
Right, and you could loop in like Elijah.
Yeah,
God
you can
brings
loop.
him into
Yeah.
heaven,
So you've got that picture that's already
Yeah.
laid for us. So if Melchizedek was this individual who, for whatever reason, didn't die, maybe he was a person,
Sure.
and maybe he was so perfect and amazing.
Or maybe he died, but the Bible doesn't tell us
Exactly.
on purpose to
Exactly.
help add more to the picture.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
So whichever view you have is okay.
Definitely, it's definitely okay. And this is such a good example of, as we've said, the different views still get to the same point about who Jesus is.
Right.
That God had designed an ideal that humans departed from, and He's going to bring us back to it.
Right.
So the Levitical priesthood was always going to be imperfect, but it was a picture of something greater that Jesus gets us to, because we need somebody to bring us back into unity with God. That's a priest's job.
Right.
But the priests who were just humans could only ever do it partially.
Right.
So this is the story of God bringing us a priest who's also the king, who's also the prophet, whose prophecies are perfect and true all the time, who gives us God's words and brings us into unity with God.
Right.
Perfectly.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think maybe now if we having said all that, if we could draw one principle, there's loads of principles we could draw, but I'm struck by the passage, I've lost the exact reference in Peter, where we're called a royal priesthood.
Yeah, that's right.
So you've got those two concepts being linked together, not with Jesus or Melchizedek, but with us.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
now
that's
we are called this
Yeah.
royalty and priesthood together.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it becomes, oh, wait, I don't deserve this. I can see Jesus. I can see Melchizedek, but I don't deserve this.
Right.
And
right.
and in actual fact, I don't.
Yeah.
But I made that
Yeah.
because of Jesus. And that's one of the things that he accomplished, was not just being this amazing, glorious mega priest or mega king, but he becomes this person who incorporates all of those character traits into me
Yeah.
as I am in him.
Yeah. And as we've said, the story of the Bible is a story of Jesus. And I think what you just described is what God wanted in the Garden of Eden. Humanity being his perfect image, who exercise his rule like kings or like priests, who are the connecting point between God and his creation. And so what Jesus brings us to in the end is what God designed us for in the beginning.
Right.
And I think that there's little hints and pictures of that, even through Abraham's story. Because you think, okay, God's gonna bring blessing back after we got rid of it through this guy Abraham.
Right.
So right before Melchizedek comes on the scene, Abraham is with his Canaanite allies, who are the ones being blessed by his presence, living under some trees, the oaks of Mamre, right? And then when Melchizedek comes, what he does in blessing is he gives food and drink, to Abraham. Like it's like these blessing, abundance, garden imagery kind of things
Right.
that are carrying through. Like God's trying to bring us back to it. And so then when Jesus comes, it's the perfect restoration to that very thing.
Right.
And that's why we are then called in to be the priests, because we're supposed to be the images who exercise God's rule, who connect God and his creation. So the overall story is that's what we're supposed to be, but we utterly failed to do it by ourselves.
Right.
The whole
Right.
point from the beginning is we need God in unity with us, or us in unity with him, really, to actually carry that out.
Right.
And he makes it possible, perfectly, eternally possible, through Jesus.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So at the end of the day, we talked all around all of these things about all the possibilities. We're left with more questions and answers again, other than the glory, the majesty, the eternality of the salvation that Jesus has provided.
That's right.
And that's what it's all about.
That's right.
And no matter how long you study it, you are still always filled with more questions and answers when it comes to salvation.
It's so complicated, but it's so simple.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It is like one of those giant tapestries that you see at the castles and the rich homes around here that take up an entire wall, are just enormous.
Yeah, took
And-
years to make.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you go up really close to it and you see the little threads and that's all you look at,
Yep.
you don't get the picture.
You're never gonna trace one thread from one side all the way to the
Exactly.
other. Yeah.
But if you back up and you
Yeah.
look at it, you think, wow, that's amazing.
That's right.
So
That's right.
that's what we're seeing.
Yep. And it's great for us to look at the threads,
Mhm.
but the purpose of the tapestry is to back up and see how
Exactly.
amazing it is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. And one day we'll get to heaven and maybe Jesus will introduce us to Melchizedek.
Yeah.
Or maybe he'll say, nope, it was me all the time. And either way is going to be just fine.
Yeah, that's right.